Hello, and welcome to my talk on sustainable digital transformation. My name is Paul Bevis. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at FSP, a digital transformation consultancy based in the UK, and we help organisations adopt, manage, and exploit digital technology. Today, I'm going to talk about what sustainable digital transformation means, why it's important, and why it doesn't have to be hard. In fact, I think in many cases, it's actually going to be very complementary to any other transformation initiatives you've already got going. So let's quickly run through what we're going to talk about some inconvenient truths, as I like to call them, on the impact that digital technology actually has. We'll talk about a framework that we use at FSP for thinking about sustainability in the context of digital technology, how that framework can be applied, what are some of the enablers that you might want to think about for your organization, and finish up with a summary and QA at the end. So let's dive in. Globally, it may surprise you to learn that IT emissions are roughly comparable with the aviation industry. So that's somewhere in the region of about 3 to 4% of emissions globally, which is huge when you think about it. There is a footprint to digital technology, but most people don't consider it, especially when it comes to the context of the cloud, and everyone kind of feels it's somebody else's problem. Data centers are driving the vast majority of that electricity usage. And here's a stat from Ireland, which has got a number of public cloud data centers in there, not just Microsoft Azure, but also AWS. And it's consuming a massive amount of electricity for of an entire country. And this is only going to continue to grow as more data centers are loaded. AI, as we all know, requires a vast quantity of data to train. And here's a stat on OpenAI's GPT-3 model, which is actually now at least 2 models behind the latest ones, and they're even larger. The size of the model, the number of parameters that are involved, impacts the amount of training required, and therefore the amount of energy required to power it. So AI in particular is clearly driving up usage. But it's not just electricity. There are other resources involved too. Here's an example of a stat regarding the amount of water required to help with the cooling. All that electricity generates obviously vast quantities of heat, which needs cooling. So it's something we need to bear in mind that it's not just the energy usage, it's resources such as water, but obviously all of the materials that had to go into building the servers that run this as well. They also have an impact in terms of what's the carbon created by building the server. So AI alone, according to Gartner, could consume almost as much as IT is consuming today, such as the exponential growth in the size of these models and how ubiquitous they are. And at the moment, they're not hugely efficient. So there is a need to think about these things. We need to be more aware of the footprint that our technology usage is having. Organizations and governments are trying to keep up with it. There are new regulations coming into play. The most recent one within the EU is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is trying to standardize the way that emissions are reported by organizations to make that much more transparent and comparable. There's newer regulations that are in the works, that are in discussions about trying to compel organizations to then have credible reduction plans. It's not enough to simply say, oh, this is what my emissions are. It's okay, and what are you doing about it? The current trend is ultimately not sustainable. It's not something we can continue to do, and digital leaders have a part to play in the solution. It's not something that you can simply outsource and rely on cloud providers. They are reacting to the demand that we put upon them. It's a shared responsibility where we're in control of how much we use and when we choose to use it. Now you may be asking, okay, so what? Well, is not just a moral imperative, it's also complementary to what other initiatives you've got going on within your organization. Ultimately, a sustainable organization is an efficient organization. The less you use, the less emissions you're going to generate, which will ultimately mean you'll pay less. But there are other benefits too. So in the example of data, if you just have less data, one, you're going to pay less because you're not going to be paying for the storage costs of keeping it all, but it's actually easier to find what you want. You're likely to have higher productivity as a result. You're just not keeping all of that old data, which most of the time you don't need it anyway. And then, of course, there's less risk. If you don't actually have as much data, there's less that could go missing. There's less that could be compromising. And studies show that looking at reducing emissions is actually more motivational than trying to reduce cost. People care about it. If given them the opportunity to make a positive difference, people generally want to do that. Sustainability also promotes better governance, because in order to be sustainable, well, yes, you need to be efficient, but you also need to be thinking about, well, what am I using at the moment? What are the emissions of using that? How much am I consuming? How much am I paying? Who is providing me with particular services? All of these factor into what makes an organization well governed. So it doesn't have to be something brand new and additive that to your organization, extra effort necessarily. It's more often than not going to be an enabler to what you're already doing. So let's start with a little bit of a framework about how we think about that within FSP. Ultimately, with all organizations, strategy starts with purpose. What are your objectives and what are you trying to achieve? Then it moves on to what sort of impact do you want to have? The rise of ESG, environment, social and governance. These are things that investors in particular are very conscious of, but more and more we're seeing employees and prospective employees being very conscious of this as well. Is your organization having a positive impact on the environment, on the people and the communities that are within? And basically, are they well run? Are they doing things by the book? Are they well governed? So most organizations that you would think would want to have a positive impact on all of those things. So then you need to consider digital assets. As your organization grows, as it continues to run, you will collect digital assets, the identities of your users, the devices that they use, the data that gets stored and generated, the applications that people use, and the infrastructure that runs them. All of them, as we've just been talking about, have a footprint, have an impact. And it's important for those organizations that want to have a positive impact to consider that. So how can we kind of start to apply that? Well, when we're dealing with most of our clients, we talk about establishing a baseline. You need to think about what impact are your assets having right now. Emissions is a really good thing to measure if you can, but there are also kind of proxies that are a useful substitute. Just consider how much you're using, for example. Cost is a factor as well, and you can consider that. The areas of highest cost are also likely to be the areas of highest emissions, but really what drives it is usage and consumption. What we like to think about when we're talking about sustainability within digital technology, and then as it comes to assets, it's really a set of principles. We want to be energy efficient. We want to consume the least amount of energy that we can. So that's looking about power usage effectiveness, how effective, how efficient you are with electricity, thinking about CPU and memory and storage and bandwidth. The less you need to use of that, the more efficient you're going to be with energy, and therefore the less emissions you have. Hardware efficiency. Using servers, it requires energy and produces emissions to create servers and physical hardware and devices. We want to be thinking about where are we getting our servers from and how efficient was it to produce them. We want to think about how long they're going to last for. Can we extend the lifetime, for example, or can we just make more use of that technology? And then finally, we want to be aware of this. A lot of organizations, a lot of people don't consider that digital technology actually has a footprint. So it's not necessarily about avoidance, it's about being aware of the impact that it's having. And ultimately doing more where and when that electricity is clean as it can be. And as we'll see in a minute, location, location, location. It really does make a big difference depending on where the electricity comes from. So measuring emissions, it's honestly, it's tricky. It's becoming easier. So here are a few examples from a concept of AI models. There are tools. This is a screenshot of the MLCL2 impact calculator. You can plug in the numbers of the model and the servers required to train it and get an idea of roughly what the impact is going to be. It's a bit crude, but these sorts of things are starting to help. Projects such as Code Carbon can give you an indication of how much emissions are being generated by the software that you're running, the thing that's actually running on the servers. Again, it's a bit limited, but it's a start. We're also starting to see cloud providers provide emissions data on the infrastructure and the servers that you're running within the cloud. But we can go beyond that, and there are even providers out there these days. And one of the ones that we've worked with is an organization called Green Pixie, which can give you more accurate emissions data than what the cloud providers will provide natively. And in fact, the dashboard we're looking at on the screen here is an example of one we've built before, which can give you carbon emissions, it can give you water usage, it can give you a plot, so you can kind of see that charted against emissions and costs. So it can kind of help organizations really get quite granular with where are the emissions being generated about, so you can do something about it. And then, as I mentioned, location, location, location. Here's a screenshot from a service or a website called Electricity Maps, which take information from the national grids in various different countries and show them to you with a nice red, amber, green status. So you can kind of start to see which ones are greener, which areas of the world are going to offer you the cleanest, the greenest electricity. And it's probably no surprise that the Nordic countries are greener than most. The UK is not doing too badly, but you can see that Northern Ireland area on the map, that's looking pretty orange by comparison. And Ireland in general is a little bit worse off than the UK. And as we just saw from that stat earlier, a huge amount of electricity within Ireland goes to running data centers. So they need a lot of power to generate that. And sometimes they've got to rely on non-renewable sources. So if running your workload in a cleaner location is an option for you, it can definitely make a massive difference. But at the end of the day, digital assets are the outputs. And whilst it's challenging to measure emissions, you don't have to. As I said, you can use a proxy. You can just be thinking about identities. How many do you actually have? Physically, where are those users? Do you know these things? How many devices have you got? And again, where are they? When are they used? What times of the day? How much data have you got spread across all of the applications that you've got? How old is it? Do you really need it? How many copies are you keeping of backups? All of those things goes into that digital heap that you have, all of that data. There's an impact of keeping it. If you can minimize the amount that you need, your emissions will go down as a result. Apps, how many do you have? Again, physically, where are those apps located? Where is that processing power consuming electricity? And obviously the underpinning infrastructure is a similar thing. Where are you physically running your infrastructure? Now, if you get the opportunity to run it in a different location, it can make a difference. Obviously, there are data sovereignty type regulations that mean you may only be able to run it in a particular area. But even within countries, there are variances in how efficient that particular area is when it comes to the electricity that's being used. So it's something we need to be considering. Cloud providers are great if you're using public cloud and you can kind of pick different regions. But even then, you don't have to use the cloud. You can go to other smaller data centers that might be more targeted. But at the end of the day, your assets are your outputs. That's ultimately what gets generated by running your organization. So we can't just establish a baseline by looking at your assets. We also need to think about, okay, well, what's driving the creation of all of that data and the management of it? We need to be thinking about the capabilities that your organization has. So here's an example, building on our framework previously, of a set of capabilities an organization might have that are likely to be impacting your digital emissions, your digital assets. And obviously every organization is going to be different. Some of these capabilities are going to be more applicable to one organization than they might be to another, and I'm sure there'll be other capabilities that would crop up that you need to think about. But here's an example of a set of capabilities that you might want to consider. So if we pick a couple and kind of dive into them, then we can kind of look at how you might go about assessing them. So initially, we'll just look at information management. So that's the management of all of the information within your organization. Typically, that's unstructured things. You might kind of find documents that you're storing in a document storage system such as SharePoint or M365. But information management is trying to kind of keep on top of all of that, ensure that the right information is being kept, it's accessible, it's accurate, you're remaining compliant. So you can look at, okay, well, how mature is that capability when it comes to sustainability, when we look at it through the lens of sustainability? So the sorts of questions you're going to be asking are similar to what we're talking about from the assets. Are how much information is there? Physically, where is it? What systems are they stored in? And is that being tracked today? The old adage of you can't improve what you don't measure. Well, how much information is currently there? Is that currently being reported? We can then start to think about, okay, well, what levers are there within this specific capability? What are the things that information management can do to actually make a positive impact? Well, information management is typically concerned with things like retention policies. How long do we have to keep information for? Yes, sometimes there's legal reasons to keep it for however many years. We don't need to keep it for any longer than that, so let's get rid of it. Use a retention policy which forces that information to be kept, but will automatically remove it when it's no longer required. Think about backups. Most organizations have got backups coming out of their ears. Do they really need as many as that? Especially with more modern document management systems, for example, you often don't need as many because they use versioning. But then that brings us on nicely to versioning, which is how many versions of a document do you really need? Lots of versions are often created automatically when you're editing a document. If you're working on a proposal, for example, you may have 5, 6, maybe more people working on the same thing. Every time somebody's making an edit, that's creating a version under the covers. When that document, that proposal is finished, do you really need all those versions? You've issued it. It's probably you've moved on, but all those versions are still there taking up storage. If you don't need it, get rid of it. Obviously, the benefits of doing it, hopefully fairly self-evident. If you don't have as much, you are likely to pay less for storage costs. You will have less rot. All of that redundant, obsolete, trivial information, you just don't need to keep it hanging around, which is actually going to make it easier to find stuff. You're going to get improved productivity as a result. Search will, or the search capabilities within your systems will actually have a fighting chance of finding the information you want around all of that junk. So sustainability can actually help you improve information management. It doesn't have to be something brand new that you're doing on top of it. these levers, these benefits are something that information management wants to provide anyway. Sustainability is just giving it an extra leg up. Another example might be looking at it through the lens of software engineering. Building applications, getting software developers to build and deploy and test and update applications that in turn probably generate data as a result. So what can you measure here? Well, we need to think about how many applications are there. Again, physically, where are they located? How much resources, CPU, memory, bandwidth, storage, do those apps actually need? And then what's the, are you calculating the impact of emissions on them at the moment? If so, great, let's publish those, make it obvious which applications are having the biggest effect. There are some simple levers you can pull here, which is ultimately about making everything more efficient, right sizing, choosing the right size server for the application. Don't choose one that's massive and spends most of the time being idle because there aren't any users actually using it. Reduce that down, use the least amount as you can. Right timing, if you get the option. A lot of times it is more efficient to run your workloads from electricity and how green that is at particular times of the day. If you've got a batch process, maybe schedule that to run at a particular time of day that's going to be best for you. And then that last one, right locating, moving the application to the greenest option that you have available to you. And likewise with information management, the benefits of doing this is not just, oh, it's an extra thing you need to do for sustainability. These are good things to do within the world of software engineering anyway. You're going to have lower costs if you don't pay for a bigger server, you pay for a smaller one, you'll save some money. You'll have more efficient software because you are using less CPU and memory. And ultimately, if you can encourage developers to automate deployment processes, for example, and use fewer resources in their development process by adding more automation, again, you'll get a more efficient software process. So it's kind of a win-win. It's a bit of a no-brainer. So you can go through the capabilities of your organization one by one. And that's a good thing to do. You can kind of start looking at them individually, and they all have an impact on those assets in one way, shape, or form. So once you've established that baseline, been through those capabilities, well, then you need to kind of come up with an approach, a bit of a strategy for your organization, something that can kind of weave sustainability in and have the biggest impact for you. So here's an example of, again, back to our framework. You can go through those capabilities and then think, okay, well, which one's having the biggest impact, or which ones do I need to worry about most? Some of which you might think are green, not having necessarily a large impact for you as an organization. It can kind of go through amber and into red of the ones that they think this is actually driving a lot of the data that our organization is using, or this one happens to be we're not effectively managing our devices correctly, which means that we don't know how many we've got, or we've got too many. Those are the sorts of things, and that'll be obviously different for every single organization. So it's important to kind of work out which ones are the most important, and obviously focus on those first. Make the biggest difference you can in the shortest amount of time. So once you've got that strategy and you've worked out what capabilities are making the big difference for you, there are some enablers that we've seen in our experience that make a big difference. So let's kind of dive into those specifically, and because they're worth thinking about for your organization as well. So essentially, what's maximizing the benefits that you can get? Is there something that can really amp it up for you, or things that you might want to be considering preparing for now, because it will make sustainability easier to weave in or implement in the future? So we've got 5 here that we've seen across organizations that make a difference. So if we go through them in turn, supplier management, that's, again, hopefully that's relatively self-evident, but a lot of your emissions are going to be generated by the people and the organizations that you partner with and you use to help you deliver your services. So the emissions of your organization is also emissions generated by other organizations to provide a service to you. As a result, you want to be thinking about how efficient are those partners. That's good supplier management. If you can reduce the impact of that your suppliers are having in order to provide you with a service, that might mean that you vote with your feet and choose a different supplier because they're greener. But it's certainly something to think about, leveraging your purchasing power. Analytics. Do you have an analytics capability already within your organization? Is there already some kind of data platform that you can use to ingest data and then report on it? If there is, great, because guess what? Emissions data itself needs to be analyzed in order to give you that baseline. So actually investing in an analytics capability can help, because you can then start reporting and analyzing your emissions data as well. Cloud ops, which is effective management of cloud applications. You can use that to help you drive better efficiency. If you are using the cloud, you certainly, well, you quite often have more choice about where you physically want to save and run your work. Big public clouds like Azure, AWS, GCP, got a presence all over the world. You could potentially choose a greener location for your workload. But in addition to that, those cloud providers, and as I mentioned earlier, other organizations such as Green Pixie, which are providing additional data on emissions for you, that information is more readily available within the cloud than it was a long time ago. And that might, if you've still got servers or applications running in your own data centers, it's unlikely that you're going to have that level of granularity that those cloud providers can provide you. And there's an emerging practice within cloud ops, which is what's called green ops. That is the focus on reducing emissions and green ops kind of thinks of emissions effectively as waste and is looking to automate wherever it can to reduce those emissions. So those sorts of additional practices that you can get through cloud ops is something that, it's just good sense when you're working within the cloud to maximize the efficiencies you can. But it also helps with sustainability at the same time. Enterprise architecture as well. So that's the process effectively of managing the evolution of a portfolio of systems that an organization has. Now, the larger the organization, the more management that's going to be required. But they're effectively trying to steer the ship. They're trying to think about the lifespan of systems that you're deploying and how do you manage the end of life process of legacy systems, for example, where you can use enterprise architecture, which can be very complementary to sustainability, because if you can start to attribute an impact to the systems that you happen to have, then you can use enterprise architecture skills and principles to help manage the retirement of legacy systems, hopefully in a coordinated way. But also you can start to think about enterprise architecture, as a lot of it is also about rationalizing, particularly at the larger end of the spectrum with larger organizations, which are probably have quite a few systems that are basically doing the same thing. Do you need to have as many of those? If you can rationalize and simplify, remove complexity, you're almost always going to remove waste. And as a result, you're almost always going to reduce emissions at the same time. And then last but by no means least, change management, which is important for pretty much everything that goes on within an organization transformation program. In fact, it's almost impossible to do a transformation program without any change management capability at all. You really need to be thinking about how can you systematically build that capability within your organization to change. And sustainability is no different. How can you harness the power of individuals, get them thinking about sustainability and trying to make a difference, and then leverage that sort of collective willpower, that collective thought process, brain power around how do we make a difference, and encourage and nudge people to choose more sustainable options, take that sustainable first mindset. So all of those enablers are not new capabilities for an organization. Most organizations of a reasonable size would have those to one degree or another. And improving each one of those will actually make your sustainability life easier, as well as moving the organization forwards. So, to summarize, technology must be used sustainably. As we've seen, it can't continue the way it is. It's growing exponentially in terms of its energy use. We all need to take action. It's a shared responsibility. It's not something for the cloud providers or application service providers to do. We are in control of what we use, how we use it, how long we keep it for it, where it happens to be. It's a shared responsibility. But it doesn't have to be onerous. I mean, it's complementary. A sustainable organization is an efficient organization. As a result, you're going to use less, which will mean you will save money as well. So it just makes business sense. You've got to focus on your assets, though. Those are those things like identities, devices, data, apps, infrastructure. They're the outputs, but those are the things that are having an impact. They are having a carbon footprint as a result. But you can't just consider those assets in isolation. You need to be thinking about the capabilities your organization has and what is driving the creation, the management, the usage of those assets, and then think about it through the lens of those capabilities. How can they be made more efficient? What levers do you have to pull? And think about which are the ones that's going to make the biggest difference to your organization. And lastly, it doesn't have to be hard. Many of the changes, as we've been talking about, are just self-evident. Having less data means you will pay less. It means you will generate fewer emissions. That is ultimately going to be a good thing for your organization. But if you kept a laptop going for 4 years rather than a 3-year lifespan, it would have a lower carbon impact as a result. I mean, this stuff doesn't have to be rocket science. The most important thing is to actually acknowledge that there is a problem and then make a start to try to make a change, to make a difference, so that your organization has a positive impact. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to find out more and read a little bit more on this topic, which, as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about, you can follow the QR code in the bottom right-hand corner there to read our Sustainable Digital Transformation white paper, which goes into a bit more detail in some of these areas. And now we'll have time for Q&A. But thank you very much for listening. Speak soon.